Hello and welcome to this episode of NRI Affairs, Pause with Nandini. I have Urmi Chanda as a guest today, who is a culturalist who writes and researches in the realms of Indian history and culture with a special focus on religion and mythology. She's been a journalist for over 13 years and writes independently for some of the most prestigious publications, including The Wire, Scroll, Quint, Outlook, Mint, Mirror, etc. She's been a researcher for non-fiction TV shows, has given talks on various platforms, including TEDx, and has been a knowledge consultant for many other cultural projects involving curation, translation, and content creation. She has experience in the museum and non-profit sectors too, placing her at the intersection of journalism, academics, and activism. Currently, she is pursuing her professional doctorate in interfaith studies as a harmony scholar from the University of Wales Trinity St. David and is simultaneously the senior program coordinator of the India programs at Seeds of Peace, an international peace-building organization. This is the bit that I'm most interested in, and we'll pick her brains on what she's doing there and what Seeds of Peace is about. She's committed to peace building and especially passionate about interfaith harmony and believes in the power of art and dialogue for driving social impact and change. That's a very impressive and very eclectic background. Hello and welcome to Pause with Nandini Urmi. Lovely to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Nandini. Yeah, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed with all my own writing and all my own doing over the years. It's a big weight to carry sometimes, but yes, I'm currently heavily involved in the peace building sector, and I'm really glad you want to talk about it, because this is one conversation that we really need. So yeah, just happy to share whatever you want to know.
You know, when I was just researching a little bit about peacemaking and peace initiatives, and I came across this the study. You might be familiar with it. It's from the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's the Global Peace Index 2022, and I was just reading some of the highlights from that. And just for our viewers and listeners who may not be familiar about the kind of research that goes into peace and measuring peacefulness, just a little bit I'd like to read a couple of things. One is that the Global Peace Index, it measures peacefulness across 3 domains, which is safety and security, ongoing conflict, and militarization. It also, this year's report says that the world is considerably less peaceful now than it was in 2008. With the average level of country peacefulness deteriorating by 3.2% in the period. Peacefulness has declined year on year for 11 of the last 14 years. So it makes it very relevant again, what you're doing. One of the interesting things I found, which I don't know if the common person sort of makes that correlation, which is the global impact of violence on the economy. And the number is quite staggering. It's 16.5 trillion in 2021, in constant 2021 US dollars in purchasing power parity terms. This is equivalent to 10.9% of the global GDP, or $2,117 per person. Now, this data seems to be quite specific, and also a little bit overwhelming to think of the direct correlation of violence to the economy. So this report says that this was an increase of 12.4% or 1.82 trillion from the previous year. Now, quickly, just a little bit about India specifically, since we are on NRI Affairs, and this might be relevant and interesting for people to know. India ranks at 135, the 135th spot of 163 countries that are part of this. So I don't think that's very flattering to know. Of course, there's a lot more detail in the report about how they measure this. The country, of course, experienced an improvement of 1.4% in overall peacefulness, driven by an improvement in the ongoing conflict domain. However, India experienced an uptick in the violent crime and perceptions of criminality indicators. These coincided with a weaker economy and increases in political instability following COVID-19, as well as continued communal violence between Hindu and Muslim citizens. Again, very relevant. There's a lot of talk around that. So with that backdrop, I'd like to get right into it. Urmi, your work with Seeds of Peace seems absolutely relevant and important at this point. And this is why I was so keen to have you come and talk about what you do. Tell us a little bit about what Seeds of Peace is, and perhaps if you can, the sort of philosophical underpinning of their work.
So I joined Seeds of Peace in the thick of the pandemic in December 2020. And because, the way it was, everything was in a lockdown, most of my work with them has happened online. But as things have opened up in the last year, so has my scope of work with them. But whether it's online or in person, the philosophy, as you said, remains the same. So Seeds of Peace is a US-based nonprofit that was started nearly 30 years ago by a journalist called John Wallet. Wallet's trajectory was somewhat similar to what I've felt about, when you've been in journalism for a while, you are reporting on what is wrong with the world essentially. And that's pretty much the nature of your work. And it's very easy to get jaded. And you see that, you're just writing about what's wrong. But eventually you're like, but what can be done about it? So Wallace faced a similar question and he said, adults meeting in conventions and so on and so forth and peace signing peace accords doesn't seem to be really making a difference, because by the time they're adults, they are, hardwired into thinking in a certain way. So he said, let me work with younger people who are still in an impressionable age. And so he picked one of the most persistent conflicts of the world, the Israel-Palestine conflict. He picked that as a site of experiment. And what he did is he took groups of adolescents from both sides of the conflict. So he took a bunch of Israeli teenagers and a bunch of Palestinian teenagers, put them together in a campsite, in a beautiful campsite in Maine in the US. So, they were removed geographically, geopolitically for a period of almost 20 days. So in those 20 days, these students came together as people. And, the way Seeds of Peace sessions are designed, there are, among other things that usually happen at any camp, there are deep dialogues. So every single day, children, teenagers from Israel and Palestine would sit together and with the facilitators' help would discuss issues that are usually never discussed around children, or there's no scope to really talk about it. And when you're actually doing it with a person who you consider the enemy, it really changes everything, because you're now hearing a human being talk about it. They're no longer just a national identity. They're not just a statistic, not a number, not an imaginary figure. They're actual real people who, like you, are teenagers who share the same, whatever phase of life you're going through. And in those 20 days, the experience is usually so transformative that you're never again able to think of the other as just the other. They're real people. They've become your friends. And the hope is that when these people grow into positions of leadership, they'll be able to stop the buck somewhere. Now, of course, Seeds of Peace has, like I said, been operational for almost 30 years and, clearly the conflicts have not stopped. But as that generation has grown into, positions of leadership, they have become active. Many of them have become active leaders in the peace building space. And peace, because it's such an intangible and such a vast concept, it's hard to see how it's taking effect or taking root. And, the wheel of time moves actually very slowly. So by the time a cumulative effect of efforts like this is realized, it may be a long while, but change starts taking place at home. So, when that child then goes back into his country, into his classroom, into his family and society, that narrative has changed and shifted forever. And then, that one person can make whatever difference they are able to make, they start making by, speaking to their peers differently. So you've already affected, you've set something in motion. A culture, a culture of peace, whatever scope of influence that one person has, that has been started. So that's essentially what the Seeds of Peace philosophy is, that we work with adolescents of who belong to different sides of a conflict group. So in India, it translates to, say, working with children from different faith backgrounds, because that happens to be a primary, conflict. But of course, there are so many other layers. We have, there are conflicts at the level of gender, at the level of caste, at the level of class. So, as we grow, we're only about 10, 12 years old in India. And the Global Office has focused mostly on Israel, Palestine, the Middle East. So India's South Asia is just beginning to sort of, emerge as a area of concern. As you said, these reports have started slowly rising, ringing the alarm about what India's state is. And, so we hope in the next few years to sort of increase our scope of work and bring all of those intersectionalities into the fold. But the crux remains the same, that we work with adolescents to bring them together. We help them engage in deep dialogue and then hope for change. So, yeah.
I really think it's a fantastic initiative. And, to your point about being able to talk to young minds while they're still open is, the window of opportunity isn't that big, right? So you got to catch them at that point. So now in India, for instance, if there were organizations that wanted to engage with Seeds of Peace, what is the best way to sort of figure out what kind of programs they could possibly have? Or as the camp that was done in the US, are there any such camps also in the near future?
So we do a local smaller version of the camp in India, which we call the Interfaith Harmony Camp. It is part of a larger program, and this has been the kind of consistent programming we've been doing in India. And when I say India, I really mean Mumbai and Western India, because of whatever limited financial scope.
Sure.
That we have a program called the Core Leadership Program, so of which Interfaith Harmony Camp is one of the components. There are other smaller programs called Humanistic Leadership, Critical Media Literacy, Be the Change. So all of this basically build up, and the cohort pretty much remains the same. So there's usually a set of 20-25 kids we work with every year across 7 or 10 schools of Mumbai. And they go from one program to the next, finally graduating when they finish the Interfaith Harmony Camp. So that is what we've been doing. And so I'll tell you, so while there is a lot of interest around this, the roadblock now in the last couple of years is the laws that have been passed around non-profit organizations. You know what has happened, so there is an incredible amount of administrative difficulty in getting funds. So the moment when you say, if organizations are interested in partnering, so very often, like as with any nonprofit, funding happens to be the main problem. So the moment you want to kick anything into action, you have to, to start with the funding. And if an international organization wants to get involved, that's the first roadblock right there. Without, this FCRA and so on and so forth, it's impossible to get money from foreign organizations. And Indian organizations, the problem is that peace is not yet a non-profit mandate, So because we're still a developing nation, and we have so many other immediate and urgent concerns such as education and health and sanitation and nutrition, that even Indian, say, corporates who want to do, say, CSR are not able to divert any significant amount of funding towards peace building, because it's not yet there with the other concerns. So that's where we're sort of stuck So we can't take money from abroad because of these issues, and we can't take money from inside because of those issues. So we are we are trying to see what best can be done.
Sure. No, I see. I mean, my background being comms and working with CSR departments, I know there's always interest where they can showcase tangible results, right? So that becomes a bit of a roadblock, like you said, because peace building, you cannot sort of say we gave away 20,000 ration packs, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's a harder thing to quantify. However, I do think as the education and the awareness around this builds, you might find people actually understanding the importance of this work. And always, I would imagine that schools and, younger people, if they're engaged, then they are your best advocates to really say that this is something that interests them. One of the things that
So,
I wanted to say, sorry, yes, please go ahead.
no. I was just saying, I don't want to sound like someone who whines, but because I'm in the thick of it, I know the other roadblock, because people need to know, and we need to figure
Sure.
out solutions around it. The NEP 2020, the National Education Policy, has
Yes.
interestingly made the tiniest bit of provision to build modules around peace. So while
Mm.
that is okay, the the flip side of it is, in India, to talk about peace without entering the domain of religion is extremely difficult. And, you know, religion becomes a very tricky territory with schools. The moment you approach someone saying, here is a peace building program, and, interfaith harmony or interfaith dialogue is something you want to do with, there's an immediate, taking of a step
Yes.
back,
Mm.
because it is because of the way the politics of this nation has evolved, and and especially the educated middle upper class. Unfortunately, we are yet limited to that population. That's our target group, the middle educated urban Indian class. They shrink away. They are not ready to engage in anything to do with religion, because we don't know how it can backfire at the moment. So that's another layer of
Complexity.
problem, that
Yeah.
complexity that is present in the peace education scenario as far as schools are concerned. I just wanted
Interesting.
to bring that up.
Um, I understand that, and I think like the challenges of doing this in India sort of are compounded by how the situation is at the moment, right? But talking about you, you've moved through many worlds, right? You've done comparative mythology, comparative religion, and I suppose you're still in those worlds. It's not that you've sort of moved away from them, they all sort of exist, coexist. Interfaith studies and peace work. So, from your personal point of view, and I'm why I want to know this is because I come across many people who are interested in making a
Mm,
difference, and you've actually managed to find a spot
mm.
where you can. What brought you specifically to this?
It's honestly, I wasn't looking for it. I've stumbled into it, and like you said, I've done a lot of meandering to get to where I have reached today. So, actually, the light bulb movement for me was in 2014 or so, when I was still in the thick of journalism, and my child was young then, so I had taken on a role with a trade publication, and the work wasn't really intellectually exciting. I was just doing something because I had to do it. So I enrolled into this course of comparative mythology, and within the first year, I was so fascinated by what I had learned that I decided that this is roughly the place I want to be in. Because for the first time, I had learned about ancient cultures across the world, something that Indian education does not touch. And I don't think it has changed with the internet, because the internet is, it's like handing over a or an encyclopedia to somebody without actually telling them where to look. So the internet is a resource like that. There is everything, but unless someone tells you what to look at, it doesn't, it doesn't matter. So studying comparative mythology did that for me. And that I know it sounds very naive now, but when I say it, put it like this, but this seeing of the unity of cultures across the world, that we're fundamentally all the same. So to me, that lesson came through that comparative mythology course. So whether I was studying ancient Nordic mythology or Egyptian mythology or Mesopotamian mythology, Indian mythology, so all our origin stories are similar in a way. The way all our societies developed is similar. And I was like, so the story of the other and how we are different from, they are different, we are different, that just melted away for me in that year. So that was my aha moment. And I was like, no, it's fine. Everyone's the same. And why has no one told me this before? Because we're so myopic in our view of, say, history, especially history. I studied in the state board, and we could only ever, you are either study about the Indian freedom struggle, or you zoom in further, because I live in Maharashtra, grew up and studied in Maharashtra. Then you focus on Shivaji. So there is literally no perspective on world history. And even then it's restricted to, say, modern history, which by which time the modern political idea of the nation has been formed, and this the separateness of in thought has already developed. So no one's talking of the unity of culture. So when you study cultures side by side, religions or mythologies side by side, and the pattern of unity emerges from them, it's beautiful. So that's what did it for me. Then I continued to write about it. I studied more. I studied ancient Indian history, culture, and archaeology. Studied mysticism. So I did like a whole 360-degree academic era of the of the scene. And finally, in 2019, then the PhD was also actually pretty incidental. I was looking for things. I knew I wanted to do my PhD, but I was thinking of how to take the mythology bit forward, or the art and culture bit forward. So the Interfaith Harmony, Interfaith Studies program presented itself to me. Applied. I got a full scholarship. And in the 3 years of figuring out exactly what to do my dissertation on, I've landed upon, peace as the ultimate thing to work towards. And in the simultaneously, my work with Seeds of Peace started. So of course my academics inform my work, and vice versa. So so you study religions, and then of course when you study them side by side and then you put them in today's context, you see that there's only conflict there. So then now what do you do about it? So yeah, that's how I have arrived where I am.
It almost seems like as your interest started sort of developing, opportunities started appearing that sort of led you in that direction, which I think is
Yes.
a very unique experience. And I think part of that is also that you grabbed those opportunities that came your
Yeah.
way. So, there is that as well. But just what you said
Yeah.
about academics and academia and thinking about peace work, I almost wonder if, and I'd love your perspective on this, that do you think that there needs to be greater synergies between academia, activism, and communities? Um, because like a lot of the things that I read about issues and how the global sort of think tank around these things are, a lot of it, to be honest, seems quite cerebral, right? And it's
Yeah.
in the realm of talking about it, discussing it, and of course there are grassroots things happening as well. And I'm quite a believer in solutions coming from community and community led, and sort of their perspective on what is needed. Um, but just given how the complexities are, I wonder what you see as sort of the holy grail where it all sort of comes together in a meaningful way. One of the examples that I wanted to ask you was that, for instance, when you're talking about these things, when you're talking about peace building and all of that, it seems quite removed in a way from popular culture, right? Popular culture might glorify violence, might not really have a perspective on peace building, or even be able to define violence beyond very obvious ways. Like, for
Mm.
instance, we talk about structural and cultural violence and all of that, and it's not really defined that way in popular culture. So, is there scope then to sort of extend it into that realm?
Um, yeah. So again, no easy answers, but coming from where I stand, see, I in the last couple of years of working in the nonprofit sector, I've already experienced my share of frustrations about how things don't move,
Sure.
things don't happen. And there's a lot of talking, and then there's very little action. And as someone who started her career as a newspaper journalist, the turnaround time was one day. She wrote a story and next day it appeared. So from going from that level of speed to suddenly for a whole year people are talking and nothing's happening, it's taken a lot of patience and a
Yes.
lot of learning. But this I've realized that there is time and need for everything.
Mm.
you know I personally don't consider myself a serious academic because I have no intentions of really making an academic career. I'm just doing it because one, it's my father wanted me to do it, and when he passed away in 2019, and I enrolled in this course later that year. So for me, it was part emotional and
Mm.
part professional. And I've always seen myself. So the holy grail is not to brag, but people like me who are, neither here nor there, and we are the bridge builders.
Mm.
So, because so society needs thought direction, which the academia provides. So it
Yeah,
is really not their job to get their hands dirty.
sure.
Those who are built that way and want to get their hands dirty, people who are at the grassroots are getting their hands dirty, will find their way there. So that is their journey. And then there are people like me who are, who've been given this part of role of, say, or we've appointed ourselves to create that bridge where we learn what we learn from here and pass it down in the most accessible manner possible,
Mm.
to where it's needed, to where it's applicable.
Yeah.
So, like I said, so there is time and place and need for each of our roles, and it's fine, So, and whatever whoever is doing, whatever in their capacity, it's great.
Mm.
But one way of filtering this down to popular culture, like you said, so mythology is, of course, as you know, in India, still very popular. As you know, as a living tradition, us Hindus are still very invested in the idea of, say, Ram, Krishna.
Mm.
These are not, unlike in the West where the Roman gods are, they're stories only now.
Mm. Mm.
Nobody there in the Western world believes that the Roman gods still exist, whereas many, 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 many hundred thousands of Indians still believe that our gods are for real. So the way, say, the politics rides on this horse of popular imagination
Yeah.
around mythology, I feel a solution is to be found on exactly the same principles. So if you can perpetuate stories and templates and characters of aggression and machismo and heroism and patriarchy, our mythology, thankfully, is rich enough for us to draw similar stories of peace from there. So the only thing to do now is to find a new generation of storytellers who,
Mm.
instead of saying, perpetuating the stories of war, will start telling stories of peace. So
Mm.
it doesn't have to be cerebral in the way, no one needs to, the common man on the street doesn't need to understand John, Galton's structural and cultural violence and the theories around it, or what was said at some office in UNESCO, doesn't matter. So, but creating a culture of peace is where I feel it's at, where
Yeah.
it could be a low hanging fruit.
Mm.
So, the story of, say, King Janak, Sita's father,
Mm.
known to be an extremely righteous king, but but that's like that's a sidebar. before one enters into the Ramayana story, which is essentially a story of violence. But what is stopping anyone, say, of telling the story of Jana, of creating, and nowadays a lot of retellings are happening. So
Yes.
you follow, yeah. So retell the story of Janak, make him a big hero, and start talking about that. So that's one way where a shift in consciousness can start happening. It's a long and slow process. So you have thousands of years of the Ram Ravan story, and
Yes.
and you pit it with against it with one story of Janak at a time, or other heroes of peace from our mythology, from our folklore, whatever it is. But I think that's probably one way of doing it. The glorification of not one who wins a war, but one who prevents a war. So there are many people in our history. It's only a matter of identifying them and glorifying them. So the narrative can shift very easily.
I think
So
that's so
yeah.
interesting, really. I think that's such an interesting perspective because it's been so defined and it's almost accepted that who takes center stage and what stories lie at the margins or what are forgotten. And that's really probably the place of opportunity. And also, as you were talking about folk tales, there's so many different interpretations that are equally valid in their universe, right? And it's only a question of bringing those all to the forefront as stories of peace, stories of reconciliation. um I just wanted to ask you, you know and I don't want to sound, again, I mean, this is meant to be a conversation of hope because we're talking about peace. But in the larger context, when you look at some of the forces at play, which is the military industrial, or you look at the couple of oligarchs who are running
Mhm.
countries with the almost hard to even believe the size and scale of the forces that peace building, peacemaking is up against. Um, do you see a tipping point, or do you see it coming in our lifetimes where peace sort of becomes center stage, at least for the younger generation, because they perhaps do not have all the baggage that we and our generations before, whether in terms of caste, whether in terms of religion, even, and polarities and othering that has been so indoctrinated. Do you see that a tipping point in our lifetimes?
So the one crisis I see, an urgent crisis that could turn into an opportunity and for us to see it in our lifetimes, is the climate crisis, because it is at our door now. It is no longer something that can be ignored by anyone.
Sure.
So and interestingly, faith leaders around the world are beginning to, including and starting with Pope Francis. He's one faith leader I deeply adore. Uh, he wrote an encyclical a few years ago, Laudato Si, which was dedicated to the climate movement. Where the last encyclical, an encyclical for our general listeners, is a open letter addressed to all the Catholics of the world. So he writes these. The Pope, whoever the Pope is, writes these periodically to basically uh, say what the church, at the moment is believing, or what its thoughts are about certain matters. So the last encyclical was on brotherhood and peace and fraternity. So it is beginning to come to the fore now, because there is an understanding that this is urgent and this is needed. So because the climate crisis affects us all, it doesn't spare the rich either. So mm, faith leaders, I won't say capitalists are yet on board with that, but and that's the thing with peace, that it's impossible to talk about peace without factoring all of these things. Capitalism is a big problem. So, and it's a web of all of these things. You can't have peace in one aspect of your life, and everything else is going burning down. So that, because that can't be, so these conversations are all intertwined. So yeah, so I think if the climate, so and on more and more forums, even on faith, for instance, all international forums. So everywhere I'm seeing, whether it's a forum on film, so there's another organization I work with that works with documentary film, film for social impact. So every forum I go to, every forum I'm present on, whether it's academic, whether it's non-profit, whether it's for profit, the conversation around climate change seems to be pervasive. It's happening, it's everywhere. So that just might be something that serves as the crisis that forces us to address the other kinds of violence. It doesn't have to be the religious conflict that we are talking about,
Sure.
but the other structural kind of, the economic violence, the structural violence, the environmental violence. So, yeah, thanks or no thanks to the climate crisis, the conversations are beginning to happen, and if at all, solutions might just emerge from there. But yeah, yeah.
I mean, I personally see with my children, they are learning far more about the environment and climate than we did in our times, for sure. And there is far more awareness as well, where they will actually check us on certain things because they're growing up with that consciousness about the environment, which I think is quite beneficial. Of course, we're talking about a very different strata, right? And I don't know if this is universal, but definitely the impact of climate change is being felt by all, as you said. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about specifically when you're doing your interfaith studies, the idea of using art as a medium. Is that something you can elaborate on? Because that sounds quite intriguing.
Yeah. So I can tell you about my dissertation. See, the program that I'm doing happens to be a professional doctorate program, which is slightly different from a PhD in that a professional doctorate uh, has to be something which is applicable.
Okay.
That's and a PhD is pure knowledge creation, but professional doctorate doer is encouraged to work on things that have some applicability in life. So it's not pure theory. So which is why it took me a long time to arrive where I have. I can now explain it very simply, but it's taken me almost 3 years to decide what it was about. So I'm looking. So in the West, interfaith dialogue so far has happened mostly around theology, because the conflict in the West, the modern interfaith movement started in the West. Mostly, it took on great importance after the Holocaust. Suddenly the world realized, what did we just do to Jews? So it was a huge wake up call for the church, and the church sort of started leading this. This trying to converse with the Jewish community, and then addressing the Christian Muslim conflict also. But because these are Abrahamic faiths, and they have theological common ground,
Yes.
so most of the interfaith discussions in the West have happened on theological ground. So when I started my PhD in the first year in class, and when we were being taught these models, I started realizing, but hello, this is not going to work in India, because our primary fighters have no theological common ground. Hindus and Muslims,
Yes.
it's not going to work the same way. So then I started thinking in that direction. So what it is, if it's not religion or theology that Hindus and Muslims can see eye to eye on, what could it be that can get them to talk? What can I use to say build an interfaith dialogue model? So a big inspiration was Coke Studio. That's mainstream for you. That's super mainstream for you. Of how for many years now, and it's probably the comment section of Coke Studio is probably the one place on the internet possibly the world where Indians and Pakistanis are not at each other's throats, or Hindus and Muslims are not giving galis to each other. They're extremely appreciative of each other's music. So I was
Yeah.
like, so art has that power to to transcend, to help a person transcend their national religious boundaries, and it has always done that. So even and I said we already have a history of this. The Bhakti Sufi synergies that took place in medieval India, we already have a history, so it's part of our collective consciousness. So
Yeah.
it's, when I suggest it, it's not going to be a very radically different idea that people will have a hard time understanding or accepting. So I said, let me assemble things from what we already have, and I curated a set of things. That was the chunk of my research. I tried to find out what were those things that are what I like to call, instances of syncretic art. Syncretic meaning which have formed as by the combination of two or more religions. For me, the focus is Hinduism and Islam. So I looked at a few art forms, and I defined art very broadly, not again in the Western sense where it's either visual arts or performing arts. So I took it in a very, very broad sense where I'm also talking about food, because that's culinary art. I'm talking about clothes. That's sartorial art. It's all, to me, it's
Talking
all
about
art.
Coke Studio.
Yeah, and Coke Studio, yeah, also Coke Studio, but that's music anyway. Music though has a place
Yeah.
in art, but I'm even talking about the humble samosa on the street. To me, that's art.
Yes.
That's food that was created because of the confluence of Hindu and Muslim cultures. So I curated a set of artistic practices, things, works that would be very easy for the most common man on the street to identify with. I didn't want to talk about arcane, things that nobody's ever heard of. Because
Yes.
no point. If you can't relate to it emotionally, you're not going to respond to it. And and people's attention spans are so small. By the time I've educated you, you've lost interest and you've gone on to the next thing. So that's what I want to do. I want to use these works of art as a means of fostering interfaith dialogue. I want to give that as the, I want to serve that as the catalyst, and hope that that will spur some interfaith dialogue, because there are no civil society spaces in India,
Mm.
and theology isn't working. So it usually lands people in a deadlock. And when if say religious leaders are still able to do it on theological grounds, the common man is not able to participate. See, what can you, Nandini, and me talk on? What can I and a Muslim friend talk about when we need to start talking about this difficult thing called interfaith
Yeah.
dialogue? How do we start? Where do we start? An easy place is a Coke Studio song, you know. And then I'm like, oh, hey, this is, the Pasuri video, for instance. I can
Yes.
see a woman doing Kathak there. So Hindu is, there is a buy-in already.
Mm.
So that's what I'm doing. So I want to look at art, which is which is part of a shared legacy of the Hindu and Muslim communities, and I want to use those art forms to foster conversations around faith. So it can start as a general thing, and then with the help of a facilitator, then it can segue into faith dialogue. So that is the crux of it.
Interesting. I think that definitely, and it's something I'm sure that it's not just for now, but it's something that you can actually work with in many different ways as the years go by. So that's interesting.
So
Um,
because you will be putting this out in YouTube, I'm just going to say this, that so how I want to do this is in the form of an exhibition, so
Lovely.
which doubles up as a dialogue space, and I am looking for funding for the pilot version of the exhibition. So yeah, if anyone's interested, they can
No,
contact
this
me.
is another thing, and I think we should talk about it quite seriously, like funding for these sort of things. And I run into a lot of funding issues with things as well. Really, like something that benefits directly civil society, right? How is it going to happen that civil society wakes up and says, hey, this is of direct benefit to me and my children and my communities, and
Mm,
therefore I need to support it? Because I suppose if we keep, I mean, there is the other argument that, it's not an individual responsibility in that sense, right? this is a structural problem, or this is a government problem, or this is a bigger problem than, and putting the onus on individuals to band together is a little bit unfair from one perspective. But on
Yeah.
the other hand, we can't keep waiting, can we? For
Yeah.
things to align perfectly. So I think, like, for instance, now something that you're doing, yes, you're doing it for your own sort of professional and personal reasons, but what you're doing is extremely important, far beyond just one person's initiative,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And to be able to bring civil society into this, and to be able to have even local businesses and organizations and schools, and those kind of people actually come forward and say that, look, this is something that we want to support. I do think the shout out needs to go more and more, that this is what we need. The other thing of this, Umi, and I come across this a lot among the NRI community, is that a lot of people want to help. A lot of people feel very deeply about issues and they want to get involved. There is this hesitation sometimes because they don't know where to put their
Hmm.
money. They can't see a quantifiable outcome always
Hmm.
with something like this. But I suppose if there's a way to articulate it in a way that, that seems tangible,
Hmm.
perhaps that is also something that can be actually worked upon. And as we're talking, I'm thinking of all the things we do as NRIs, which is fundraise for various things, or their cultural programs and their interfaith things as well that happen.
Hmm.
This can be an added sort of layer, an added thing to talk about, which is initiatives that are in India, which actually are going to make society more peaceful and bring communities together. So we'll
And
definitely.
honestly, I think, sorry to cut you off. I just said, like, this model of the, like a pop-up exhibition come dialogue forum is, as you said, it's universal, so there's nothing stopping me from, taking this to a completely different country and a context. All I would have to do is change the,
Yeah.
artworks a little, contextualize it. But the model, I really believe it works. But as you said, it's very hard to show tangible benefit, for someone who went to an exhibition and chatted with a fellow citizen about a slightly uncomfortable issue. It's very hard to say, what good that'll do. But
Yes.
it's a cumulative process. Like I said, it takes a long time to actually start.
And the other thing is that perhaps, I mean, there are people for whom the economic impact of violence uh,
Mm,
will come home somewhere in their consciousness. They understand that. People understand the economic impact. They understand how it could affect business, how it could affect investment, things like that. And which is why it was quite a revelation to me that there is an actual, there's data that supports the need for peace from that point of view as well.
yeah.
And perhaps there's conversation to be had around that when we're looking for funds and when we're trying
Mm,
to do fundraising. Um,
yeah.
One of the things that I did want to ask you was that, look, as we're starting out in our careers, many people honestly don't know where it's going to lead and what they're going to do. And I think the world has become so much more receptive to change in that sense. You can jump, you can hop, you don't have to be stuck at the same job forever. And just from your experience, for someone who wants to work in broadly in this space, what are some of the sort of transferable skills that have come in handy for you, that have helped you move so many different roles? I think that might be useful for people to know.
Mm, I'll I think mostly my writing and research skills. I've used it and employed it in many different, in pretty much every career, every job switch that I've made. My primary, these are my primary tools: research and writing. That's what I do. So so I employed it once as a journalist. I still do occasionally. I continue to employ it when I say work in the nonprofit sector as a coordinator of programs. I also do it, as a researcher and as a peace builder. So strong communication, because ultimately that's where it's at.
Hmm.
Peace building is essentially about
Yeah.
communication, as is everything else. So a strong, and equipping, and nowadays, you've got to be a master of everything. You've got to know your digital tools. You've got to, be able to create at least some basic visual tools. If you have to augment whatever communication it is that you're creating, so
Sure.
whether by say means of podcast, so that's held me in great stead. But like I said, peace building is so vast, depending on where you are placed or you're most comfortable at. Like I said, there's a place and purpose for and need for everyone. So you can situate yourself in the peace building universe. It's a vast universe. There are so many intersections and there are so many kinds of violence. So if you relate, say, to uh, the cause of education, get into peace education. You relate to the climate crisis, so you situate yourself there.
Sure.
And there is, uh, and in the building of a movement, you need all kinds of skill and all kinds of people. So, more than seeing it as like a career opportunity, because it's not really, it's more like a philosophy to be lived.
Hmm.
So, it all adds up. So whether you're an accountant also, but you're doing accounting, say, for a non-profit organization, you volunteer time there, or you start working for them. So that's
Sure.
your way of bringing peace into the world, rather than using, say, your accounting skills for a blood-sucking capitalist. You choose to do it for a peacemaking organization. So where you want to employ your skills, you're, say, an artist or an illustrator, you join hands with a peace building organization, many of which are volunteer run. Everyone's looking for resources, or you. I'm not saying everyone needs to work for free. Peace work doesn't have to be for free, because we all have to also, earn a living. But choose to employ your skills for people or for organizations or towards causes that will, create, that are geared towards creating a more equitable society. So there are hundreds of organizations, non-profits, individuals. So when you find your niche, you find your space and interest, you now start gravitating towards it, and you find a place. So it could be anything, honestly. You want to dance, you want to sing, you want to cook. There are n number of ways to contribute to peace building. You want to just help. You have none of these skills. You can just be a volunteer. Go serve at a langar, I say. When crisis hits, go clean a beach. You don't have to have a skill. Uh, but I went for a beach cleanup recently. Very inspiring. Was very inspired, and that's something I want to do 1 hour in a week. So that's my way of, say, adding, my doing my bit for peace building, for environmental peace building. I'm cleaning up other people's kachra. That's basically what peace building is. Clean up other people's shit.
I,
So yeah.
in that other interview you had done, you had said something quite interesting. I don't know if you were quoting someone, or you said even littering is a form of violence.
Yeah, yeah,
It's,
yeah. It
it's
is. It is.
reframing what violence is. I don't know how many people honestly will see poverty as violence, or see inequality, or even the caste
Yeah.
dynamic as grossly violent, and be able
Hmm.
to reframe it in those terms. One of the things, and I know we've had you for a bit, and we'll try and wrap up, but there's just so much to talk about. One of the things I do want to ask you is that this friction between the individual and the family and community, and as you're working with young people, your insight into, because this is one of the hardest things, right? Like, we can go out and say a lot of things outside. We can talk about diversity, and we can talk about interfaith harmony and all of that. We can even say that, we are moving towards being more educated on caste. But in our homes, as young people, it's one of the most difficult things to do, to take on people you love and to
Mm.
say, look, I don't agree with what you're doing, and I think you need to stop. And just because your organization works with young people who are trying to break those conditioning, that kind of conditioning towards peace building, what is your sort of insight on that?
Um, so peace starts from within, which is a very important lesson. You cannot be a peace builder unless you're at least at some level of peace. You know, the inner journey is equally important, and because that manifests, right? You know, we project our problems and prejudices into the world. So if you want to take on the work of peace building, the first place to start working is on yourself. And all of this, of course, you know, you can't go away to the Himalayas for 14 years, work on yourself, and then come back. It's a gradual, you know, you learn as you go along. But that awareness, so that is a conversation, and that's also part of peace education. You know, peace education has multiple aspects, one of which is inner peace. So that's something, again, you know, so that's not just the domain of old people, spirituality. And if our youngsters are beginning to talk, you know, on very woke terms these days, where is it coming? It's coming from the internet, it's coming from your Instagram, TikTok. So there are ways of educating. So it doesn't need to come as a sermon.
Mm.
There are ways of you know, of talking to our children as equals, and you know, instead of dictating, you educate them about the importance of self, you know, work on yourself, and you offer them examples. You work on yourself, they learn, you know, children learn by example, not by, you know, lesson. So that's something to do. Second, the whole culture shift is also part of education, peace education. This, you know, because in our generation, by the time, you know, when we were in school, though, we were taught to respect your elders. So even if your elder is an abuser, you know,
Mm.
there's no name for it, there is no recourse, there is no solution. You know, you, so in the name of being, you know, maintaining your peace or whatever that.
Ironically, yes.
Yeah,
Ironically, in the name of
yeah,
keeping peace,
yeah, yeah. So, but
you
not addressing conflict is never going to achieve lasting peace. You have to, you know, conflicts have to be addressed. You can only shove so much under the carpet, because one day it's going to come out one way or another. So these are the intersections. You know, mental health and spirituality is one thing that intersects very intimately with peace work. But you know, that's not the usual approach. You know, people think of peace education, people think of dialogue and mediation and, you know, high profile, whatever, shaking hands and in AC rooms. But peace work really starts at the individual level, from your home. And again, the Indian parent, you know, because I'm zooming into the Indian system right now because that's our context. This thing about, you know, you respect your elders and you don't talk back to me, because that is, you know, we're teaching them hierarchy then. And then that when they're not giving, we're not equipping with them with the tools of standing up to the wrong when they see it. So if they're not able to stand up to their own elders at home, how are they ever going to have the courage to do it with strangers, you know, and on public? So they're not going to be equipped as citizens in the future to be able to step up, you know, when they see wrong, because they've been taught all their lives to not confront authority figures. So here is a change we need to create in ourselves as parents and teachers first. That, you know, however uncomfortable it makes us, however it opens the doors for smaller conflicts, because it will happen. You know, human nature is equal, you know, has equal parts violence and peace. So you cannot do away with violence. When I say creating a culture of peace, that does not mean violence will never happen. Violence is inherent in us, you know, people are people. So, but we have to be able to learn to sit with those discomforts. We have to make room for the smaller skirmishes so that the larger objective of peace is realized. So I think that's where it starts, that we allow it. It starts with us allowing our children to back answer, you know, and not being offended. not taking offense and saying, how could you say that? I'm your mother or I'm your father. Don't talk to your father like that, even if the child is making very legitimate points. So, so it has to start from there. And yeah, then I think that might help us raise sensitive adults who know the worth of value of listening, know the value of dialogue, know the value of confrontation when it's needed. So, yeah.
No, this is an endlessly vast topic. And, what you said about empathy and deep listening and all of this, I'm glad to see that somewhere that shift has begun in some ways. And I suppose, we can only be hopeful that this will continue because, like we were talking about, the younger generation have different orientations than us, right? Um, Finally, we've spoken about a lot of things that are difficult, a lot of things that might seem insurmountable in some ways. But personally, what keeps you hopeful in the work that you do?
It's the people, honestly, that I meet. Um, like I said, as a journalist, for some time, it had turned me into a hardened cynic, my work in journalism. And I wasn't even dealing with news. But, I was a culture writer most of my time, but you have to stay on top of the news cycle, which means you're constantly consuming,
Yes.
because news, what makes news is generally conflict and what's wrong with the world. So when you're constantly only listening to that and reading about that, it's very. I was jaded. I was like, I was in that place where many people are today. कि कुछ नहीं हो सकता, कोई फायदा नहीं, मत करो. But as I started moving into the sector, I started meeting more and more people, each of whom, who goes above and beyond their little selfish interests. All of us who are doing this, you for that matter, when you fundraise, when you step into fundraise, most of us live very small lives. We safeguard our own professional and personal interests, and of our families. We want a house, we want a vacation, we want a gadi bangla, whatever. But then this community that I started interacting with, I saw young people, old people, all age groups, all orientations, really stepping up and going beyond themselves, putting themselves in spaces of hard work and no tangible, no lucrative return for their labor. But their only wish is to, make the world a better place. So, and I saw heroes again everywhere. For a while, I was believing that the world is shit and everyone's shit and everyone's bad, everyone's a villain. But then no, this community is everyone's a hero for me now, and that brought a lot of hope back. The CA and RC movement was a big turning point for me. I'd just gone to the UK and the movement was in full swing back home, and I felt like, oh man, what am I doing here? I should have been there back in my country. And every time someone speaks of despair and says, no, this country has gone beyond the point of redemption, nothing can happen, I said, just think back 3 years. If what the media is showing us were the truth, only just 3 years ago, lakhs of people would not have been standing on the streets asking for the rights of their fellow citizens. So we are made to believe, we are sold a certain narrative that that helps the cause of the powers that be. But I really think that's not the truth. Our truth is the CANRC movement. That is the truth of our people. That is the truth of our India, and that gives me hope. And yeah, that inspires me to do what I'm doing. And I've made peace with the fact that, how it's a lot of these fables about you plant a seed and, in your lifetime, the tree may not grow, it may not bear fruit, but that's okay. I'm happy. I've accepted that if I move the needle even the slightest bit in my part of the universe, I will have done something, and it's better than not doing anything and constantly despairing. So I don't care about the fruit. that the seed might someday bloom into. But I do want to plant the seed because there are so many others who are doing the planting with me. That's where I'm at.
Oh, very beautiful. Thank you. So inspiring, actually. And I'm so glad that our paths crossed. And hopefully, we'll have fabulous funding for your amazing exhibition, which will
Thank
all
you.
around the world, sowing seeds of peace. And I'm sure I would definitely love to speak to you again, in particular about peace education
Yeah.
and all the facets. And I saw that lovely presentation that you had done, and I think that itself, will require a whole session just to itself. What peace education is and what it translates to, and what are some of the tools that people can actually use, young people can use in sort of furthering the cause of peace. But I let you go and thank you again so much from NRIFS and wish you all the very best.
Thank you so much, Nandini. It was such a pleasure to talk to you about this. Uh,
Absolutely.
and yeah, I definitely hope to reconnect very soon.